Hello, everybody. My name is Hannah Rothschild, and Natalie and I are going to be in conversation shortly. Just a bit of intro about both of us. Natalie is, as you know, the founder of this wonderful festival and its chairman. But we could talk about just that and how much fun everyone's having. But what we're here today to talk about is her really wonderful book. Where is it? So not that one. Which is called The Women of Rothschild. And I highly recommend this. And I have no, I'm not on any royalties or anything, by the way. I know we share a name, but that's as far as it goes. This is beautifully written and beautifully researched. And I'll tell you a little bit about my background. You might be surprised to also know that in here there were revelations. There were stories and people and everything else that I knew almost nothing about. And I know probably I should have done, but I think it's a reflection both on the depth of her research and also perhaps on my family's attitude to the women in their history and their past. But we'll come on to that. A few words of introduction about myself. Yes, I am of that ilk. I am a filmmaker, an author, a philanthropist, and a businesswoman. I work in the family business. I'm one of the first women to do that. My gateway book, if you like, as opposed to a gateway drug, which we could also talk about, but we won't today, was actually a book about my great aunt, who was known as the Jazz Baroness. And I'd made a film about her, and perhaps we'll talk a little bit about why I was interested in her later on. But I realized that there was so much more to say about her than I could just say in a BBC documentary. So I then wrote this book. I haven't, to be honest with you, since then wanted to write about the women in my family. But in my most recent book, The House of Trelawney, there is a woman who's crazy about collecting fleas and insects, who's extremely eccentric, who drives her family slightly crazy. She's called Aunt Tuffy, and some people might think that she bears a relation to my great-aunt Miriam. Of course, I deny everything, but there are a few similarities. So to start, listen, a lot of people think they've got a book in them, but you and I know that it's one thing to have a book in you. To get a book out of you is a completely different story. I mean, these things are not easy undertakings.
I don't know what you're talking about. It was a breeze.
It was a breeze. Oh, I'm glad you had that. I mean, they're hell, aren't they?
It was a challenging but rewarding experience.
Oh, you are so on message. I was hoping you were going to drop it a bit.
No, seriously. It was obviously a very difficult book to delve into. It was a very difficult book to research, and there were also themes that were incredibly difficult to confront. And obviously it took 6 years to write. So it kind of dominated my thoughts and my dreams and my actions and everything that I did for 6 years. So yes, it was a massive challenge. But I'm actually very grateful because out of it, I've got to know these extraordinary women. And, I'm obsessed with them.
So we'll come on to that. But so what gave you the idea in the first place? Why did you think, that family, so to speak?
So I just published The Mistresses of Cliveden, and as you said, everyone thinks they've got one book in them. I never thought I was going to write a book, and then I came here for one of the first times, and I looked at all the portraits around this great hall, and I thought, how fascinating, I'm going to write a story about the women of Cliveden. I loved doing that. It was great fun. And I published it in 2015, and I actually wanted to do another one. I was desperate immediately to do another one. It's almost like, when you give birth to your first child, you immediately want to go on to it, number two, and, hurry. And I thought about the two things that I was most passionate about, women's history and Jewish history. And actually, I was having lunch with Andrew Roberts, who very kindly reviewed The Mistresses of Cliveden in the Evening Standard. And I said, what do you think what do you think I should do? And he said, well, what about the Rothschild women? And I just thought, oh my God, it's such a big subject. I can't possibly. So, and I don't want to flatter you too much, but I picked up The Jazz Baroness, right. And I read it from cover to cover, and I was completely hooked. And I thought, this is a totally unexpected story, and I'm in.
Great. Well, thank you for that. we can talk a little bit about why I fell in love with that story. But just coming back to you for a little bit longer, I think that you can probably, listen, it's really awkward, funnily enough, talking about one's own family often, because you feel that, I feel slightly embarrassed as if I'm trying to kind of tell a big story, and then I feel, am I part of it? I'm not part of it. Should I be doing this? Should I not be doing this? So if occasionally I look a little bit shy, it is because I actually genuinely feel a little bit shy about this. And I certainly wouldn't do this for anybody else, but Natalie's quite persuasive.
I'm very grateful.
But again, let's just think. So one of the things that's quite interesting about growing up in my family is that the women do not register. So they are not in the family trees. There are, I can't remember how many pages, something like 40 pages of tree, so-and-so begat, back. My grandfather was obsessed to tracing us back to Moses. He actually only got as far as the ghetto in Frankfurt, but that was fine. But anyway, but you look at this tree, and it's weird. I mean, there are no women in the tree. And when you grow up with that, and you don't have, you are almost cancelled, if you like, that's a strange thing. But the story is even odder, and maybe you would like to say a bit more about NM's will.
Well, what I found extraordinary delving into it was when the founding father of the Rothschild dynasty, my Rothschild, died in 1812. In his will, there was a codicil in which he disinherited all of the women of your family, and he forbade anyone to work in the bank other than archivists or bookkeepers. So in effect, what he'd done is he'd relegated the Rothschild women to footnotes in history. And that was something that was just passed on from one generation to the other. And it was a truly willful exclusion.
Yeah. So we've had there's been a theme, I think, developing over the weekend, which is history versus herstory. And it's been some incredibly interesting discussions about female history and how women are portrayed in history and whether there's too much emphasis on male history. And I think, again, that's something in this. But is there a danger, do you think, that in trying in a way to redress the balance of women being excluded, that we might be putting a spotlight on lives that aren't always worthy of that spotlight? Or did you feel when you researched the story, actually it's okay, there are women here who are worthy of a lot of examination?
Well, that's a really good question, and actually I think it's more than okay, because there are some things that I discovered in the course of my research that profoundly affected the way I looked at Jewish history. For example, the Balfour Declaration. In Jewish folklore, the Balfour Declaration is indelibly associated with...
Explain what that is.
The Balfour Declaration was a document in which the British government agreed to support a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And it was addressed to Walter Rothschild, who was your great uncle. Yeah. And actually, the first Clifton Literary Festival, one of the first events we ever had was 100 years of the Balfour Declaration. And it was Walter. It just went without question. Actually, what I found out when I was in Waddesdon, looking at letters of Rozsika and Dorothy, I found something extremely interesting, that actually the first Rothschild to be introduced to Chaim Weizmann, the Rothschild who really was responsible for making the Balfour Declaration happen, was not in fact Walter. It was the wife of his brother Charles, this virtually unknown Hungarian, brilliant political thinker and idealist called Rozsika. And it was actually Rozsika who lobbied the Rothschild family for the Zionist cause. It was Rozsika who tried to convince them to support Chaim Weizmann. It was Rozsika who saw in Chaim Weizmann, who was quite, he was a passionate idealist, but he was quite rough around the edges. He had this kind of folksmensch from the Pale of Settlement way of speaking. He was, he loved to entertain people with stories of bloody anti-Semitic massacres, which didn't go down well in polite English society. So what Rozsika decided to do was to set up some kind of coaching or unofficial coaching or communication advisory committee with her cousin Dorothy, in which they educated Chaim Weizmann to modulate his tone, and so that he would be more palatable to the politicians who would then go on to help make the Balfour Declaration. Interestingly, they did the job so well that actually Nancy Astor, who's over there, who's a famous anti-Semite, said about Chaim Weizmann that he was the only decent Jew she'd ever met. So Rozsika was extremely powerful. And I just think it's a terrible shame that the Balfour Declaration has gone down in Jewish history as being addressed to dear Uncle Walter. And actually, I think Rozsika and Dorothy really, really deserve a mention in there.
So this is, to be blunt, this is one of the revelations in this book. So I know of, obviously I know all about the Balfour Declaration, and I know all about Great Uncle Walter, and I'll make you amuse you a little bit. So Great Uncle Walter was, or Great Uncle Walter was profoundly unsuited to banking. He was really only interested in wild animals, and what he loved doing was collecting them and stuffing them. And he put them in his own museum, and you can still see them at Tring. It is, if you haven't been to Tring, it is heaven. There's even a floor which has stuffed domestic dogs. I mean, unless you're squeamish about that, I couldn't recommend it more highly. He was enormous. He was 6'7". His snores apparently could keep the whole of Tring, which is a very large house, awake at night. And he decided, one of his things, he decided he was going to train zebras to pull a carriage. Now, zebras, as you know, are wild animals, but that didn't deter him. And he did indeed manage to train them. And he, to the horror of his family, he decided to drive a coach pulled by zebras up the Mall into Buckingham Palace to meet the Queen. Now, the zebras, unfortunately, were so unbiddable, he quite sensibly at the last minute swapped one of them for a pony. But he did indeed do that. And there are also wonderful photographs of him riding on giant tortoises, and he turned the park at Tring, which was this family house, into a kind of menagerie. And there were kangaroos, and there were cassowaries, and emus, and zebras, and God knows what else.
His mother, Emma, called it fairyland.
Fairyland. So they need. So going back to the Balfour, because what happened is that they need Lord Rothschild. Was. So people call the Rothschilds aristocrats, and I don't think that's right personally, because I never felt like an aristocrat. But he did have a title, and that was important, I think, because it gave a kind of credibility to the Balfour Declaration, which is incredibly important to the Jews of the time.
Well, it changed the history of the Jewish people, and
eventually led to the foundation of Israel. Some decades later. But Walter himself was obviously a profoundly not unworthy, but unsuitable recipient.
Well, he was
of this
a very
letter.
Unpolitically minded character.
He just wanted to be with his animals.
He wanted to be with his animals, and that was not his area of interest. He was a brilliant zoologist. Politics were really not so much his thing.
And he had a brother called Charles who was married to Rozsika, and Charles, unfortunately, tragically, suffered from the family affliction, which many families have, which was depression. And one of the moments of when he was less depressed was when he went on a butterfly hunting mission to
the
Carpathian Mountains, where he met this very wonderful
Hungarian, sporty Jewish girl who'd invented the overarm serve in tennis and used to jump over barrels while she was ice skating, and was incredibly energetic.
And wasn't young, by the way. She was already 40.
She was 34 when she got...
but which is, which was
terribly young. I mean, but when you consider that other Rothschild women got married just, barely past, 17.
We may not go there today.
But she was relatively old, but she was extraordinarily charismatic, and she was obsessed with Proust, and she spoke 5 different languages, and she used to read different newspapers in different languages, and
she smoked furiously.
And was a formidable character.
Very. And then this terrible thing, she arrived, and you say this so beautifully in your book, which I didn't know, by the way, which she had this obviously quite thick Hungarian accent. And when the war breaks out, the First World War, people start writing her off as a German, so she's a German, so that she has this kind of, she has a double, there's anti-Semitic things, which I'd like to talk about. There is obviously the female issue, there's her heavy accent, there's being a foreigner, etc., etc. And a husband, and let's not underestimate this, who was profoundly depressed and ended up taking his own life in their home. And so can you just paint a picture then? So what do you think it was like arriving age 34 into Tring, which is this mansion's now school actually in Buckinghamshire?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't imagine. I think one of the leitmotifs of the Rothschild women female experience is that of being an outsider. You know, Rothschild women were outsiders by virtue of their gender, by virtue of their religion. But for Rozsika, she was a Hungarian coming to England. So she became an outsider in her own family. I mean, even her cousin, Constance, was suspicious of her because she thought she confused her Hungarian accent with a German accent. Not only that, she had the general responsibilities of a Rothschild wife. She had to look after these palatial houses. She had to produce numerous children. She had to educate them beautifully. But not only that, she had a husband who was really, really unwell. Mm-hmm. And because he was so unwell, and his older brother, Walter, was busy riding tortoises and zebras and collecting butterflies, Charles, who was profoundly unsuited to banking, was given the responsibility of running the London banking house, and he couldn't do it. So Rozsika had to take on those responsibilities. She had to look after him. She had to look after her young children. And she had to, at the same time, navigate what it was to become a Rothschild wife. An extraordinarily strong, dynamic character who was absolutely determined to make her mark on politics. And she wrote a wonderful letter to your cousin Dorothy saying that she loves idealists and fanatics, and Chaim Weizmann is both. And that was what she was passionate about as well. So she was a really, really extraordinary character who I don't think has been written about very much. I think that's a terrible shame.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, another thing which must have made your life quite difficult, I know when I was researching the Baroness, which drove me nearly crazy, which was that there's a lot, I mean, again, this is not totally unusual, but there was secrecy was very, very, very important. Secrecy protected the Rothschilds when they were in the ghetto, frankly, from persecution there, and obviously there's been persecution through many, many different generations. Being, Jewish families, in Europe, not unusual story. So secrecy became absolutely endemic in everything that happened. And there's a description, for example, when Walter died, of this enormous bonfire, and they sent the local fire brigade because it was so big, they thought that the house must be on fire, but it wasn't. It was actually, he'd left instructions to burn all his papers. So again, I went in, I mean, there were different reasons why it's difficult to research the family, and the secrecy incidentally continues. I remember when I was writing this book, my father, who's on the whole very supportive of my literary endeavours, on the whole, but he did say, do you really have to do this? And I said, I think I do actually. He said, okay. And that was, I'm afraid, that was probably the nicest and most supportive reaction from the male Rothschilds. Most of them were not so nice. And, it was difficult. I mean, I imagine that you had it's quite tough navigating those archives and that absolutely endemic secrecy.
Yeah, I mean, we've touched on intergenerational pain quite a lot this weekend, and I do think there are certain traits that become embedded in the DNA of a family, and I think because of that will of exclusion in 1812, secrecy was one of those core elements in the Rothschild family, which went unquestioned. So there was this really terrible practice of burning family papers after a death. Rozsika's papers were burnt. No one knows about Rozsika's death, about her last days. It was this compulsion, we must destroy, we must keep everything to ourselves. And I think in a way that's understandable, because when you think about the origins of your family, you originated from a ghetto. It was from this, extreme exclusion. So of course that's going to bring about secrecy, and I completely understand that. But and in a way, I think there is something really voyeuristic about doing any kind of biography or history. You're kind of sticking your nose into other people's business where it doesn't really, really belong. So there were moments where I was looking at letters and looking at diaries, and I was kind of thinking, well, it's really none of my business. It's really none of my business that Constance wasn't satisfied with her sex life and had to keep complaining about it and then redacting bits in her diary. And, so it's a kind of... It's a kind of strange duality.
It is. Well, we'll come back to Constance, but I mean, I think the beginnings of the family, which are quite legendary, and well, within the family, I have to say, probably not to anyone else, but so they were in this road known as Judengasse in Frankfurt, and they lived in a house 14 foot wide or 12 foot, I can't remember. Anyway, it was tiny. Very, very, very narrow.
5 stories high.
5 stories.
Cantilevered building.
That's right. And there were 13. Gretel Schnapper, unbelievable woman who had
prolific child.
13 children.
I think she gave birth to 19.
19.
And 10 of whom survived to infancy.
Wow.
But the interesting thing about Gutler and Maya Amschel is that everyone knows that they had 5 sons.
Yeah.
But lesser known fact is that they also had 5 daughters.
Yes, and the daughters absolutely don't get a look in, but that will. So they're born there, and he's a coin dealer, Maya Amschel, and at that, and it is so squalid, this road. And I must talk about something else you've said in your book, which I'll come back to. But it was so squalid, it was so disgusting. The streets ran with vermin, with excrement, it was so that it became a place that you went to on your gap year or your grand tour, rather like now someone might go to. We're not allowed to say this, but young people with a backpack might go and have a look somewhere really awful, and I won't mention places. They're probably posher than here now, but anyway. but you know what I mean? But that's where, so you get Goethe, you get the contemporaries writing about this place, and you get them writing about these etiolated, yellow-faced, kind of half-humans. Well, no wonder they're half-human, because there's literally, the street is so narrow, the buildings are so tall, that you don't get sunlight. And this is where the original family came from, and it's from where the 5 sons were sent to the 5 capitals. But Gutler, as you pronounce it, I always called it Guttel, but it's Gutler, is it? Anyway, whatever. But I mean, she refused to leave lest her descendants ever forgot. And actually, she lived to a very ripe old age, as you say. So, and younger generations would go and visit her.
Yeah, she lived till 96.
That's right.
This kind of crazy old woman who had phenomenally wealthy sons living still in this tiny little house, the Grünschild, because she was incredibly superstitious, and she thought if she left the Grünschild, that the luck of her family would change. But she was this matriarch, and members of the family would have to make annual pilgrimages to see her. And but that's that's another thing that there is this myth of this idea of Gutler, the pious, frugal, fertile matriarch. Actually, one of the things that I discovered was that in her dotage, in her old age, Gutler was actually quite a bon viveur. I mean, she did live in the Grünschild, but she loved going to the opera, she loved going to dances, she loved her specially made lace caps, she loved her jewellery. I mean, this idea of this very, very frugal little woman is actually not true, because she did come to enjoy life at the end of it.
But interesting, when the family then moved to London, you have very good descriptions, actually, of St Swithin's Lane and roads in the city, where it felt very similar in a way to Frankfurt, which I was terribly surprised by. I always assumed that they moved here and it was kind of relatively salubrious, if you like, but apparently not.
Well, in one generation, one of Maya Amschel and Gutler's sons, Nathan, moves to London, and actually he goes and does an apprenticeship with a man called Levi Barrett Cohen, who was actually the father of his future wife, Hannah Barrett Cohen. And actually his first job was in textiles. So he went to Manchester, and they lived in a very ordinary street. He lived in a very ordinary street with Hannah Barrett Cohen. It was incredibly prosaic. There was nothing grand or poetic about it. And he worked extremely hard. And it was only, once, the banking business started to take off, that they were able to live in this luxury and live in this style. But the other interesting thing is that London at the time was a very, there were sectors, and there was a Jewish area, it wasn't walled, it wasn't an official ghetto, but it was ghetto-like. And I think, that there must have been that sense of familiarity there. Yes.
And it's interesting, again, because, so Hannah was N.M. Rothschild, who's an extraordinary character and achieved extraordinary things, but was a very rough diamond, put it mildly. He was, people, you just really wouldn't want to have him to dinner, I don't think.
He didn't even speak English. He refused to speak English. He refused to learn English. He refused to do any of the cultural
That's
activities that Hannah was so keen on, because Hannah's view of being a Rothschild, what it meant to be a Rothschild, was to make a supreme contribution to the Jewish community. So she saw her role as a Rothschild wife as having a huge communal responsibility. She wanted to make her family cultured. She wanted to make her family educated. She wanted to have the best musicians teach her children how to play the piano. She wanted them to be educated. She wanted them to be multilingual. Nathan didn't want any of it.
No.
He just...
all business.
No interest whatsoever.
And amazing to think, though, this is a guy who as you say, never learns English, tries to build a business, goes from Manchester to London, and yet has this astonishing success. But I don't want to in any way to say that it's that the female is soft power, but what she does is, if you like, is to civilize him. But I think it's more than that. She worked out that business isn't just done in the boardroom. Business, actually, as we all know, is done in the ballroom, sometimes in the bedroom. But basically, this, and she worked that out. She knew that actually it wasn't just a question of assimilation. But, if you were really going to advise governments, if you were really going to make your mark, you had to know the right people. You had to get the right people in and understanding it. And that's, I think, one of the things that she did, and actually subsequent Rothschild women did.
Actually, I think the interesting thing about Hannah is that she went one step further. Yes, she was very, very good at exercising her soft power, but she also identified pretty early on that if the Rothschilds were going to have the political and social influence that she wanted them to have, they needed to have political representation.
Absolutely.
And it was Hannah who spearheaded the Jewish emancipation campaign. And it was Hannah's passion, and it was Hannah's vision that one day there would be a Jewish member of parliament. And without her vision and without her passion, her son Lionel would never have become the first Jewish member of parliament. So I think it was in the ballroom, but she also understood that in order to make a real impact, political representation for the Jews was essential, because at the time, a Jew was not allowed to sit in the House of Commons, because if you were going to take the oath to be in the House of Commons, you had to renounce your Judaism and swear your allegiance to Christianity. So it was impossible.
So it's interesting. So that's in the 19th century, but even in the 20th century, talking to my great-aunt Miriam, she said that they lived at Tring. She would say that they weren't ever invited to local grand houses because they were Jewish. So I wanted to come back. We've spoken quite a lot about anti-Semitism over the last couple of days. Different people have spoken very eloquently and movingly about it. And I wonder if you can give a flavour of... So here we have these women and their husbands coming in, trying to make their way in this country. And how much of a role... There's two questions, two sides to this question. How much of a role do you think anti-Semitism played in their lives? And yet, conversely, how much of a role did being Jewish and that holding the family together with what we know are one of the wonderful things about being from a Jewish family, a sense of family, a sense of custom, a sense of... So there's two things, aren't there? You both want to retain your identity, but also perhaps you're being criticised for that identity. And could you talk a little bit about how you found that in your research?
I mean, it's an impossible dance. And I think that, the Rothschilds were a product of anti-Semitism. Their cradle was a ghetto. They were brought up without clear skies, without fresh air. So that was their origins. And then they moved to England, where was systemic anti-Semitism, and it was part of their lives. The fact that Jews were not able to sit in the Houses of Parliament. That in order to ensure that the Christian elites would accept their invitations, their catering had to be better, which is why the Rothschilds were so obsessed with having the best food and the best wines. And Hannah Rothschild would bring in these fabulous caterers from Paris, William Jarin, to make these amazing confections and beautiful tables. And that was the way they would lure these, the Christian elite to their table.
I've got to tell you a good story. So Queen Victoria, they finally get Queen Victoria to come to lunch at Waddesdon, and so excited. I mean, you can imagine. And they were so excited that every single Rothschild came from all over Europe to have lunch with her. So poor old Queen Victoria arrives and she sees this kind of, ranks of Rothschilds in front of her. And she does a complete number. She goes, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing this. And she then insists on eating alone with a lady in waiting, which is in another room. But now, that's often told as a kind of anti-Semitic story, but actually I can imagine having been to a few family events.
The interesting, we're talking about systemic anti-Semitism. The interesting thing about Queen Victoria, reading her diaries, she would describe Jewesses as round-eyed and hook-nosed. Now, she wasn't consciously anti-Semitic. That was just part of the vernacular at the time. That was just part of the discourse. So, it was so embedded in the system. Men would be introduced in Parliament as a great Jew hater, and it was just that was what was said.
Yes, I think so. I mean, she did. She also, she said that she wouldn't have a Jew in the House of Lords. That was not. One would not consent to a Jew being in the House of Lords. And this is obviously late 19th century. So it's I agree about the vernacular. I was rereading The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope, which I had, interestingly, I'd read it when I was 20, I think, probably. And I reread it recently, and I was so unbelievably shocked, not by his language, which is, many, many descriptions of Melmoth as a filthy kind of garlic-chewing Jew, which of course are terribly shocking to read. If you read that about anybody, it'd be very shocking. But actually what was more shocking was how as my 20-year-old self, didn't remember that. And I think that's part of the reason it's terribly, terribly important, actually, for us to be very, very clear about why language matters and why we have to fight against it. Because actually just in my lifetime, I've become much more sensitive to what's okay, and I've become much more, I do think it's important, and I now think back. So when my grandfather Victor took my grandmother on the first date, he took her to a restaurant called Wilton's, which still exists. This is 1936, and he was frightfully excited because she was very beautiful, and he was very in love with her, and he marched her up the road, and and he knocked on the door of Wilton's. The man opened it, and he looked at him. He said, "Lord Rothschild," and my grandfather said, "Yeah," thrilled, that the man recognised him. He said, "We don't serve Jews here," and that was 1936, and that was and I think that's really hard, actually, to get over. I think it's a really difficult thing to. Particularly when you're taking, not just because he was on a date, but that's so recent, it's not that long ago. And I just thinking back to these women trying so hard, buying these huge houses on Piccadilly, stuffing them full of beautiful things. They had the most exquisite taste. They really chose, and they had the money to do it, they chose the best of the best of the best. So these houses look completely extraordinary, but that feeling of being an outsider, however long, that's why I say I don't feel like an aristocrat, because I still don't feel like an aristocrat. I'm a very, very privileged person, but I don't feel that I'm necessarily part of that tradition. I think because I still feel that from my recent forebears. I don't know, how do you think they cope with it, these women?
The anti-Semitism and
being...
Well, I think in a way they were kind of equipped, they were hardened to it, because being a Rothschild woman, you were already an outsider. So I think it was something that they, that they expected, but it was also something that, starting from Hannah, they fought against in a very structured and graceful way. Hannah realised, as I said, that the best way that she could give her family representation and the best way to counter anti-Semitism was to have a Jewish representative in Parliament. She effectively passed on that baton to her daughter-in-law, Charlotte, who was the wife of Lionel Rothschild, who became the first Jewish member of Parliament. And Charlotte was hugely aware of her communal responsibility. And but instead of, she wrote extensively, and she really, really was at the vanguard of the campaign. I mean, as much as Hannah was responsible for Lionel becoming a Jewish MP, Charlotte was she spearheaded the campaign, she canvassed on the streets of his constituency, the City of London, she wrote incredible open letters to newspapers, she cultivated an extraordinary set of friends. She was very, very close to Disraeli. The editor of The Times, Thaddeus Delane, would pop in to 148 Piccadilly, their London house, every single day to kind of decide what was in the news. So I think they tried as hard as they could to change the system from within.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's, I mean, Lionel was himself, extraordinary. He lent the government money to do the Crimean War. He lent them money to do the Suez Canal. He set up an extraordinary charity during the Irish famine. I mean, he, if anyone deserved, frankly, a seat on the bench, it was Lionel. And I think you're absolutely right. But it was pressure. It was just gradually changing people's expectations and whatever.
But what I think is sad is that, yes, of course, Lionel deserved that seat. But Charlotte worked so hard and wrote a lot of his campaign speeches, wrote a lot of his letters, wrote a lot of his manifestos. And it's a shame that Lionel has gone down in history as the first Jewish member of Parliament. And you see these, the fabulous portrait of Lionel, finally taking the oath. And Charlotte is nowhere to be seen because she was not allowed to come down to the floor. She had to stay in the gallery. And also, her contribution has subsequently been airbrushed out of history.
Well, that's why, frankly, your book is, so personally important. I bought yesterday, sucking up to you, no, not really, but I bought 5 copies. I bought 3 for my 3 daughters. I bought 1 for my father, because I thought he ought to read it, and I bought 1 for my boyfriend, who actually is unbelievably supportive and not like that at all.
Thank God, 5 sales. Okay,
5 sales. By the way, it's out here now, but you can't get it in a shop. For how long?
Well, it launches on the 11th of November.
Right, so you've got this.
But there are a few copies that, if you rush,
there may be none left, by the way.
You'll be able to buy some in the festival bookshop, but run because they might sell out quickly.
Yeah, no, I might have to come run after this as well. By the way, Natalie will be signing after this. I should have said that right at the beginning. If there was one female Rothschild that you had to choose, who you'd like to be, or maybe even just give more, another biography, is there one that stands out?
Well, that's an impossible question because, when I was researching each of the women, I was completely entwined in their story. But I think, for me, the standout character of the whole book and the whole research process was Miriam Rothschild, who deserves a biography of her own. She deserves a TV show of her own. She deserves a movie of her own. She was a self-taught scientist. She was a polymath. She helped compile the Willful report, in which homosexuality was decriminalised. She was a precocious environmentalist. Before there was Stella McCartney, there was Miriam Rothschild. She refused to wear leather. And she was a world expert on fleas. She was absolutely obsessed with fleas. She used to keep packets of fleas on the bedposts around her house. Yeah. She had pet owls, she had pet foxes. She was an extraordinarily eccentric, wonderful woman. I remember there was a journalist in The Times who said, in order to prepare for a meeting with Miriam Rothschild, think of Beatrix Potter on amphetamines, and you come close. So she was utterly enchanting.
No, she was a very, very important figure in my life, extremely important. And I remember my first meeting with her, she turned up. My parents used to give these dinners, and there was a kind of loud knock on the door, or ring on the bell, whatever it was, and she came in carrying a box. And she put the box, I can't remember who was at the dinner, but there was kind of various bigwigs or something, and she put the box on the table, and then she whipped off the cover. And inside there were caterpillars of all different colours. And she said, the children ought to know if you feed insects different coloured leaves, they turn a different colour. And of course, it was just kind of, oh, okay. That was a kind of, marvellous. And then I'd occasionally go and stay with her. And which is
at Ashton Hall.
At Ashton, which was quite... Ashton Hall was this house that her father had bought. And when she inherited it, she lopped off the top floor because, being an environmentalist, she said, who needs 3 floors? I only need 2. And she never cut a bush or a tree or anything else. So it was an incredible experience of kind of working your way through the kind of hedgerows and bushes and everything else and into the hall, and which also the ivy had worked its way through the windows into the room. And I remember going to bed the first, I was probably about 11 or something, and I remember going to bed the first night, and there were more mice. I cannot tell you. And I don't particularly mind animals, thank God. I was brought up in, after all, that family built this family, our family. It's terrible. It's got a conjugation issue, haven't we? How do you identify it? His, her, our, them, but. But anyway, so there were millions of mice. And the next morning I came downstairs to breakfast where she was sitting. And she never said hello or goodbye or anything else. I said, there are quite a lot of mice. You should be thankful. That means there aren't rats. And that was the end of it. And there were mice would be running up and down the table, and there were, and there was also a resident fox, and there was
the foxes would come for lunch.
Yep.
She'd have all these really, really, terribly posh aristocrats come for lunch. They'd be utterly horrified to find themselves sitting next to a fox.
Yeah. But that's the thing. So there's that, which again, and you tread this very carefully in your book. So it's wonderful to sit here and tell stories about this kind of wacky woman. But actually behind that, there was somebody who, became a fellow of the Royal Society, who was an incredibly distinguished scientist, who catalogued fleas and butterflies in a way that nobody had done, who wrote, I can't remember how many scientific papers you might know.
Countless books, papers,
absolutely.
Biographies.
Yeah. And she remember, again, so her brother, again, part of this history, her brother Victor was sent to Harrow and he had an education, but my great-grandfather believed that education was a waste for women. So they were taught up to the Romans, and it stopped. And that was it. And they weren't taught anything. They were not talk about... There was a talk about flowers, if anyone knows what I'm talking about. I don't want to be embarrassing. Thank God my children aren't here. But, which are periods, if you like. And her mother said something, you'll get flowers at some point. And she described the kind of absolute kind of bewilderment about this conversation. And that was literally her education. And then she then decides to educate herself, which has never been done before. She takes herself off to a local polytechnic. She gets O-levels, A-levels, whatever the equivalents were, etc.
And she gets her own research table in Naples.
Yeah. And it's a humongous... look, I don't want in any way to say that... being born into this family is an unbelievable privilege. It's just an extraordinary privilege. And there are so many wonderful things about it, and there's no taking away. But actually, people like her have pioneered the next generations. Thanks to her, that now education is absolutely the bedrock of every female Rothschild, I think.
But the wonderful thing about Miriam is not only did she change things for your family, but she changed things for whole groups of people. One of the things that I found really touching and unbelievably fascinating about Miriam was that her sister, Liberty, had very, very bad schizophrenia. And at the time, mental illness was treated in a really aggressive way. It was, there was electric shock treatment. Lobotomies. There were rumours that Dr. Freudenberg, Liberty's doctor, gave her a lobotomy.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, those papers have been destroyed, so there's never, we've never had any proof of it. But Miriam really pushed back and challenged the status quo and took Liberty out of an institution and looked after Liberty, cared for Liberty, and Liberty lived with her.
Yeah, no, Liberty you'd be, again, with the mice, Liberty would come in and, very, very sweet, kind of shuffling in and not saying very much, and would then maybe sit down or maybe leave. And Miriam set up the first schizophrenia society and put a lot of money, behind trying to, understand what schizophrenia was. But
she used her scientific knowledge, because she was one of the first people to start to look at mental illness in the same way that physical illness was examined.
That's right.
So what I love, one of the things I love so much about Miriam is that she came to treated issues in a cerebral way, but also a highly emotional way. So with her heart and her head, she was able to make so many dramatic changes in society at large, and for her own family.
Yeah. No, she was remarkable. Listen, I know that you show lots of questions here, so I'm going to throw it open, and then if there aren't questions, I will use the time. But perhaps somebody might have a question. Any questions? There's a lady here at the front. I think there's a mic as well. I think there's another at the back as well. Come to you in a moment.
Hello. You mentioned at the beginning the notion of worthiness, of someone being worthy of having their story told. I wonder what you mean by that.
Did I? I did.
Worthiness.
Natalie did. Worthiness.
don't think I did, but
I
I believe, if I did, I believe very strongly that everyone is worthy of having their story told.
Sorry, you're right, I did say something. I didn't quite mean, what I meant was in our attempt to redress what has been a terrible imbalance in the telling of history, do we ever feel that somehow we're going to make too much of a life which may not have been worth it? And that was a provocative question, to which I believe that Natalie gave quite a good answer. But do you want to go on with that question?
No, I don't think so. Well, only actually, Natalie, yesterday I didn't hear your voice in her story, his story. You hardly got to speak at all in that debate. And that was quite frustrating for the audience, I think.
I think my husband was utterly relieved, if I'm honest.
Well, you were very gracious indeed. But the way that women's stories can be told is very different from the traditional way that men's stories are told. So, for example, a historian friend of mine is looking at records of an alcoholic institution in Victorian times and taking their records and then matching them to court records and looking at the press at the time and trying to find the voices of working class troubled women to tell their story. And they were proper ne'er-do-wells, really unworthy. But I think their story is important in humanity.
I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely, there's no story that's not worthy of being told.
Thank you. Lady at the front here, and then the girl behind, please. Have you got a Sorry, just here.
Thank you. My name is Rani Singh.
I know you, Rani. You interviewed me on River Radio. Hi, I'm so happy that you came.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for your lovely interview. It's available on podcast with Natalie from River Radio, 16 minutes about Clifton, actually, about the literary festival. So I hope you'll come on again to talk about your book. Now, both of you have done a lot of research, obviously, for your factual work, and I guess you've had a lot of special access. I'd like to know some of the fascinating places you were able to do your research. And from each of you, please, out of all your fascinating research, what was the one thing that hit you the most, that stayed with you as a memory, and the place you found it, please?
Oh, gosh, what an amazing question. Do you want to take that?
No, I'll let you take it first while I think.
So, first of all, to answer your question about special access, no, there was no special access. I mean, we're very lucky that the Rothschilds have got two fantastic archives in this country, the Rothschild archives in London and the Rothschild archives in Waddesdon. And, I had incredible access to the most extraordinary letters and diaries. And, it was a real treasure trove to be able to kind of delve into these women's lives and really get to know them as human beings. So in terms of, a highlight or, that was extremely, extremely meaningful to me to actually get to know these women. But then what was the second part of your question?
Sorry, I didn't mean special access. I meant the places that you would go to that I wouldn't necessarily know about.
Well, I think the wonderful thing about your family is that that's not the case. If you want to go to Waddesdon, you can go to Waddesdon. If you want to go and visit the bank and the archives, you can go and visit the bank and the archives. It's not. If you want to go to Tring, if you want to go to all the wonderful houses, that are run and maintained so beautifully. The only one that isn't is that I haven't actually been able to get into is Mentmore.
Well, Mentmore's now just boarded up. It was it's occasionally used as a film set for St Trinian's or something, but it's pretty much boarded up. I'll tell you what I remember. So there's my great aunt Nika, who is the subject of the Baroness, was named. It turned out it was a very odd name. I remember reading about her, and it was Pannonica. What is Pannonica? And someone said she was named after a butterfly. And it was the butterfly that her father was trying to find in the Carpathian Mountains when he met her mother. And it was terribly romantic. And then Thelonious Monk wrote a song about her called Pannonica, and in it you hear My Little Butterfly, and Monk talked a lot. Thelonious Monk was her great companion and great.
We haven't even touched on Nika, have we?
No, we haven't. Well, there's another one. Anyway, we're touching here. We're touching, and so there was this incredibly romantic idea about this woman being named after a butterfly, who then flew away from this family, the Rothschilds, and made her own life in New York, and did something completely extraordinary there in her own right. And I went to the Natural History Museum because I thought I want to go and look at this beautiful butterfly. And I knew her before she died. She died in the 80s. And so many years later, when I was writing this book, I went to find the butterfly. And remember that Walter gave 60 million insects to the Natural History Museum. And that was only half of his collection. Half of his collection went to America, and it's now the Natural History Museum in New York, and the other half is the Natural History Museum in London. And so I went there, and this incredibly nice, what's the hell's name for an insect specialist? Anyway, this guy who's devoted his life, like Miriam had, to butterflies and fleas, took me through
Entomologist?
I can never know. It's one is about language, and the other one's about insects.
Entomologist.
Enters insects, is it? Yeah, great, thanks. Anyway, so we went through, and it is, this you can also do as a member of the public, you have to book it. So you went through rows and rows and rows and rows and rows of these things, and you beautifully preserved, all in their mahogany cases with the glass and all wonderfully polished. And eventually he pulls out this drawer, and there is this really nondescript little yellow thing. It's like faded. And he goes, there it is. And I said, that can't be Pannonica. He said, yes, it's Rothschildiana, Pannonica, Hungariana, or whatever. There's a word for Hungary as well, which I can't remember. But anyway, and I was really, really upset because I assumed it was going to be the most ravishing specimen. And I said, and he looked at my face and he said, why do you look so upset? And I said, well, I said, pardon me, else it's a moth. No, it's not, it's a moth. And he goes, butterflies are just moths with go faster stripes. Anyway, so that is, I think, and that was a kind of marvellous moment where research can take you. Research can take you to the most, unexpected and glorious places, not just physically, but in your own mind. So I never look at a moth the same way again. There was a question that's right, there's somebody in that row, yeah.
Hello. Oh, yes, yeah. It does work. Fantastic. Thank you very much. That was so interesting. My question to you is so the whole purpose of the book is, as you said, to sort of redress this imbalance between the stories of the women of the Rothschild family and the men. And I was just wondering if you were maybe we need to read the book for this, but to go sort of right back to the beginning and just give a bit more context around why that imbalance existed in the first place. Why were the women written out of the will so with such purpose in the first place, and how that trickled down?
So, first of all, I didn't start writing the book with a purpose. I think it's quite a dangerous thing to do when you have an agenda to set out writing a book. What I did was I started doing research, and I found extraordinary, vibrant characters. But I think, as I said at the beginning, the root of the exclusion is the will of the founding father, Mayer Amschel Rothschild, in 1812, in which he excluded the women from working in the bank, and in so doing relegated them to footnotes in history. So I think that is the point at which the exclusion happened.
I think also, the Jewish religion, you can't be a Jew unless your mother is Jewish. It goes through the mothers, but unfortunately that doesn't necessarily extend to how women are always treated in ultra-Orthodox societies. And I think I see that. I work a lot in Israel, and I see that, unfortunately, that I don't believe that women are always given the equal footing in those families. Now, my family hasn't for a long time been ultra-Orthodox. So I'm not saying that, but I think at the time, it wasn't that unusual to exclude women.
Absolutely,
I'm afraid, in that
at
religion.
the time, it was a very, very harsh way of expressing it, but it was not unusual at the time to exclude women, to disinherit them. I think that's been a theme of this festival this weekend, how much exclusion there actually has been and how much work there is to be done to reclaim these lives.
But what is interesting, I think, is and I think is very sad, is so I'm the 9th of generation, but if they'd only, the idiots, frankly, no, but seriously, if they'd only opened the doors to women, the family, I can assure you, would be doing much better. So, for example, at the beginning, and I'm really serious about this, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was an absolute dearth of able males to work in the bank. I mean, you had Walter, who was marvellous, but, off with the fairies in fairyland. You had Charles, who unfortunately was very unwell. You had, I won't call out other names, but those are my direct ones, so I feel I can with mine. So you had a lot of different Rothschild men who were completely ill-equipped to run businesses. And then, as Natalie is showing in her book, you have some really capable Rothschild women. If only they'd brought them in, I think we'd have done a lot better, actually. I mean, we're doing quite well, obviously, but I really think that, seriously, I mean, it is how insane to cut off half your talent pool. How insane, and how insane that still happens.
Well, Miriam put it really eloquently when she was given her first entry in Who's Who, as the first woman of the family to earn it in her own right. She wrote it was a source of malicious delight to see that her brother and the bank had been ousted. So there was huge awareness of that.
And there's now, I have a cousin called Saskia who's running Lafitte and is doing absolutely brilliantly. There's, other cousins are running female cousins are running other aspects of the business, and it's like half the sky. Why on earth why restrict yourself in a talent pool? That's what I say. And I think it was really to their detriment that they did that. That's my and I would say that. But there's another question before I get. There's a man at the back waving. I'm sorry, I can't. It's very hard to see. Somebody waving there and someone else. Hi.
Thank you very much for your talk. There's been a bit of a focus on anti-Semitism, but there is a particular aspect of anti-Semitism that I wanted to ask about, and that is the anti-Semitism that is particularly focused on the Rothschild family as opposed to any other family. I mean, maybe these days we could add Soros, but the Rothschild family is sort of tied up at this very, very centre of this Jewish conspiracy theory of controlling the world. And I just wondered whether it is for the Rothschild women or the Rothschild men. If they walk around and they go to some places never seen them, where people think they've particularly got horns coming out of their head if you looked at some of the things on the internet. Is there something specific, what I wanted to ask, that has affected the Rothschilds with the anti-Semitism that doesn't affect other people who are Jewish because they don't have the Rothschild name?
It's a really interesting question. It's quite a painful question, if I'm honest with you. And it's not a question that I can answer terribly well. I think they have become a totemic family. The name is quite totemic. I think success over many generations means that they become something that you can fixate on, and that fixation, we saw came up yesterday in this David Baddiel and Simon Montefiore, Seaback Montefiore talk. They were talking about the cartoon you probably saw that Corbyn had not told them to take it down, which appeared in the East End. And that cartoon was actually one taken, I think there was another very similar one from Goebbels. There was a very similar one painted on the wall, for example, in Frankfurt. That same, which is kind of, I don't even want to dignify it by describing what it was, but it was a very, very anti-Semitic cartoon. And in each of those, the Rothschild families had been mentioned. So I think there is something which almost like, a snowball, which, as it goes further on, gathers. But look, I don't do much social media because I get horribly vilified because of my surname, and I don't quite understand why still people feel that they can do that. But they do, and I think one of the things, just going back to Natalie's wonderful book, which I read with pride, incidentally, because I see, in addition to the one side of the story, the extraordinary things that these women did for charity, not just for Jewish women, a lot for Jewish women, but whether incredible acts of generosity that subsequent generations of women did, and through their generations, and the real difference that they made by putting their good fortune to help others. Yeah. Okay, lots of hands. I don't know how to get this. I think you're going to have to decide. I can't do it. Thank you.
You're both absolutely captivating storytellers. I've been completely wrapped in what you've been saying. But one of the questions I wanted to ask as a historian is, you talk about these pyres of letters and things, papers that were burnt. What do you think was in those letters?
Oh, I think we know. I think we know there was a lot of detail about physical and mental illness. And I think that there was just a huge reluctance to confront the reality of that. Would you agree with me?
What was in the letters? I don't know. I don't know. I'd love to know. God, I'd love to know. Well, I'd rather not, actually. I think I won't. I won't hazard a guess. I'll leave that to somebody more imaginative than I am. Okay, gentleman here. Yeah.
I was going to ask something similar, actually. Did having the access to these archives overcome the obstacle of these burnt letters, or do you still feel a bit hindered in your research?
Well, I mean, Charlotte Rothschild wrote, "We Rothschilds are inveterate scribblers," and anyone who's trying to delve into the wealth of letters and diaries in the family will know that there are so many. There's so much that's been written. There are so many diaries. There are so many letters. There's so much information that, hopefully, the book didn't suffer. Obviously, it would have been wonderful to have more access. You always want more and more and more information. And obviously, it's a terrible shame that there was this willful destruction. But, I think you just try to make the best of it.
So look, I know everyone's got questions, but Natalie is going to be signing, which is a brilliant moment to you can get one-on-one answers to these questions. And I think we're leaving on the thing of what more there is to do. Obviously, we're looking forward to the next volume, which is obviously not going to go to the present day. Very important. But actually, funny enough, I did see one of my foreign relations, French relations, in fact, very foreign, who said, well, I don't know why she's done the English ones. I mean, the French are much more interesting. So anyway, there is your next book, if you can place it.
And can I just also say a huge, huge thank you to Hannah. I'm hugely honoured that you've had this conversation.